The morning Sister Agatha read my grandfather's will aloud, every girl in the dining hall laughed. Not quiet laughter, not polite laughter. The full, ugly kind that comes from people who have been waiting to see someone fall and finally got their wish. 40 girls at long tables with tin cups and cold oatmeal, their heads thrown back, their mouths open, the sound bouncing off the stone walls until it filled the whole room. Sister Agatha Keene stood at the front with a probate letter in one hand and a look on her face like she had found something unpleasant in a drawer. She had a hard white wimple, a narrow nose, and the permanent expression of a woman offended by hope. When the laughter died down, she folded the letter, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Well, Ada, your grandfather has left you a bridge over dry land and a barn full of weather. I suppose even the dead can make a joke." I was 16 years old. My mother, Eliza Mercer, had died of childbed fever when I was 9, delivering a brother who never drew breath. My father, Thomas Mercer, had vanished in a March freight storm on the road north from Georgetown when I was 12. They found his wagon. They found one mule still alive. They never found him. After that, the placements came fast and ended faster. 4 months with Aunt Lena in a Denver laundry until she remarried and said the extra mouth had to go. 10 weeks with the Tice family in Golden until I corrected Mr. Tice's account book aloud, and he told me girls who thought too much made bad wives. 6 weeks with the widow Ames, who found my habit of reading by candlelight disturbing and wasteful. And 14 months at St. Bridget's, where they taught us to sew, to scrub, to keep our eyes down, and to be grateful for what little we were given. I had $1.63. I had a carpet bag with 2 dresses, neither of them warm enough. And I had the habit that got me called strange everywhere I went. I read manuals, almanacs, survey reports, anything with measurements in it. At St. Bridget's, I had stolen 3 agricultural pamphlets from the church basement and a water-stained soil guide that I kept under my mattress, like contraband. Now I had an inheritance. 18 wind-scoured acres on a bench in North Park, Colorado. 1 leaning cabin, 1 barn set 30 yards away across open ground. And between them, a scatter of half-driven timber pilings that went nowhere and did nothing. The valley called the place Mercer's Air Ranch because nothing stayed put there but the rocks. My grandfather had bought it 30 years earlier for $11, and people still laughed about the price. Too exposed for decent shelter, too rocky for plowing, too shallow-soiled for hay, too far from anywhere that mattered. The man himself had been called strange his whole life. He had spent decades out there doing something nobody understood, driving stakes into the frozen ground, writing things down in notebooks, building posts that supported nothing. The neighbors said he was touched. Sister Agatha said he had clearly lost his mind long before he died. And now everything he owned belonged to me. I stood in that dining hall with 40 girls staring, with cold oatmeal congealing on my plate, with Sister Agatha's words still ringing off the walls. A bridge over dry land, a barn full of weather. But something about those words caught fire in my mind. A bridge over dry land. A man with no money had spent timber and labor to lift a path into the air between his own door and his own barn. That was not foolishness to me. That was evidence. Evidence of a question I did not yet understand. Something lit up inside me. Not a match, but a furnace. And I decided right there, standing in that drafty hall with the laughter still echoing, that I would go to that worthless land and I would find out why. If you want to find out what I built on that frozen bench in the Colorado mountains, how a 16-year-old orphan with nothing but a carpetbag and a habit of reading turned 18 acres of rock and wind into something that saved an entire valley when the worst winter in 50 years arrived, then subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what my grandfather left behind, what he had been building all those years that everyone called him mad, is a story that still stands in those mountains today. I left St. Bridget's 3 days later. Sister Agatha did not try to stop me. I think she was relieved to have me off her ledger before winter. The train took me as far as Laramie. From there, a freight wagon headed toward the mining camps agreed to carry me west and south for 50 cents, and the promise I would not talk. I kept that promise. I sat in the back with sacks of flour and watched the country open and flatten, and then, after a day, begin to rise again. The road got worse. The settlements got smaller. The fences got rougher and then disappeared altogether. The driver dropped me at a crossroads 4 miles from the property because he refused to take his mules farther up the bench road after dusk. He pointed at a notch in the ridgeline and said, "Mercer's place is that direction. If you die up there, it won't be my fault." Then he drove away. I walked the last miles carrying my carpet bag, wearing the only coat I owned, and watching the sun drop behind the mountains. The basin was enormous. North Park, they called it, though it was not a park in any sense I understood. It was a high valley ringed by peaks, beautiful at a distance and merciless up close. The wind never stopped. It came across the open ground in long, steady gusts that pressed my coat flat against my back and made my eyes water. The grass was short and silvered. The air smelled of pine resin and dust and cold stone. When I finally saw the property, I understood why people laughed. The cabin leaned slightly east, as if it had been listening for bad news for so long that it had given up standing straight. The roof had a visible sag in the middle. One window was boarded over. The other was intact, but filmed with grime so thick the glass looked brown. 20 yards away, across open ground, already scarred with old drift lines and gray ridges, sat a barn that was in better shape than the cabin, but not by much. The doors hung crooked. One corner had been patched with boards that did not match the rest, and between them, running from the cabin's front step to the barn's main door, stood a line of half-driven timber pilings. They stuck up out of the grass like broken teeth, maybe 4 feet high, with nothing on top of them. No planks, no rails, just posts driven into the ground and abandoned. I stood there in the dying light and thought, this is what Sister Agatha was laughing about. This is the joke. 18 acres of rock and wind, a cabin that might fall over in a hard storm, and a row of posts that went nowhere. I almost turned around. The thought was clear and specific. I could walk back to the crossroads. I could wait for another wagon heading east. I could return to Denver and tell Sister Agatha she had been right. I would rather sleep in an alley than sleep in this place. But I did not turn around. Not because I was brave. Because I was curious about those posts. They were too deliberate to be random, too evenly spaced. Someone had measured, someone had planned, and that someone had died before finishing, which meant either the plan was impossible or the person had simply run out of time. I walked to the cabin and pushed the door open. Inside, it smelled of mouse droppings, old wood smoke, and something faintly sweet that I later learned was pine sap from the roof patches. The stove was cold. The floor was dirty. There was flour enough for maybe 4 meals in a tin by the counter, and the bag had been chewed through at one corner. But the place was orderly. Pegs on the wall labeled in pencil, hammer, awl, rope, nails sorted by size in tobacco tins on a shelf. A square and plumb bob hung together on a single hook, and on the shelf above the table, a row of weathered wooden stakes with dates burned into them. Each stake had 2 sets of numbers. I did not understand them yet. I slept that night on a narrow cot with a wool blanket that smelled of old sweat and cedar. The wind pressed against the walls all night. The window rattled. I woke 3 times, certain someone was outside, and each time it was only the wind. In the morning, I explored the barn. The structure was sound enough. Stalls for maybe 8 head of cattle, though only 2 showed recent use. A hayloft that was empty except for old stems. Tools hanging on the walls, most of them rusted but serviceable. A workbench under a small window with good light. And in the back corner of the loft, behind a stack of old harness leather, a section of wall that did not match the rest. I almost missed it. The boards were the same color as everything else, weathered gray, but the spacing was wrong. The gaps between them were too even, too deliberate. I pressed my hand against the wall and felt it give slightly. The false wall came away in 3 pieces. Behind it was a pine crate wrapped in oilcloth, tucked against the roof beams where no one would think to look. My hands were shaking when I opened it. Inside were 14 ledgers. 14, each one labeled in a tight, careful hand. Northwest drift, early storms. Lee slopes and yard corners. Barn gap tests. January, measurements. Fence, shadow studies, wind speed, and snow weight. There were also folded site diagrams, a compass, a bundle of sharpened stakes, and one unfinished letter. The letter was addressed to Miss Ada Mercer, care of St. Bridget's Home for Girls. I sat down on the loft floor with the letter in my hands and read it 3 times before I understood what I was looking at. My dear Ada, I have never met you, but I have thought of you often. Your mother spoke of you in her letters, your questions, your stubbornness, your habit of reading things no one expected a girl to read. She was proud of you. I think she saw something of herself in your curiosity. I'm sending this letter with instructions and with rail fare, in hopes that you might come to me before winter sets in. I am old, and my work is not finished. I have spent 28 years studying how snow moves on this bench, and I believe I understand it now. But understanding is not building. My hands are not what they were. I'm asking you to come and help me build something that everyone says is impossible. A path that stays clear when everything else is buried. A way between the house and the barn that does not depend on weather being kind. The notebooks contain everything I've learned. If you can read them, you can continue my work. If you cannot come, I hope you will at least know that someone was thinking of you. Your grandfather, Enoch Mercer. The letter was dated 18 months before his death. It had never been sent. Or rather, it had been sent, and Sister Agatha had intercepted it. That was the only explanation. Enoch had written to St. Bridget's, and Sister Agatha had decided that a mountain ranch was no place for a girl, and she had thrown the letter away, or burned it, or filed it somewhere I would never find it. She had made that decision for me, and now he was dead, and I was here anyway, and the notebooks were in my hands. I did not cry. Not then. I was too angry to cry. I carried the crate down from the loft and into the cabin, and spent the rest of that day reading. Enoch Mercer had been watching snow for almost 30 years, not watching it fall, watching it move, watching where it went after the wind picked it up, watching where it piled and where it stayed thin, watching the relationship between wind speed, snow weight, and the obstacles in a storm's path. He had filled 14 ledgers with measurements, date, wind direction, snow character, dry or wet, heavy or fine, and consequence. Where did the snow end up? What depth? What shape? Northwest blow, dry grains, barn door buried by dawn, fence at full board catches death where cattle must walk, gap below slat run leaves less where feet must go. He had driven stakes into the ground at measured intervals and marked the drift heights after every storm. He had sketched the shapes of snow deposits against corners, under eaves, beside fence lines. He had noted which structures caught snow and which let it pass. And slowly, over almost 3 decades, he had worked out a theory. Snowdrifts do not form randomly. They form where the wind slows down. When moving air hits a solid obstacle, a wall, a fence, a pile of brush, it loses velocity. When it loses velocity, it drops its load. That is why snow piles against the windward side of buildings. That is why fence lines become walls of white. The obstacle creates a zone of still air, and still air cannot carry snow, so the snow falls out of the wind and stays where it lands. But what if you could design an obstacle that did not slow the wind? That was the question Enoch had spent 28 years trying to answer. What if you could build a structure that let the wind keep moving underneath it? What if you could create a path that was elevated above the zone where snow accumulated, with open space below so the wind could continue on its way? The half-driven posts in the yard were not a failed project. They were the beginning of something. The notebooks contained diagrams. A raised walkway, 4 feet off the ground, running from the cabin door to the barn entrance. The deck would be made of planks with small gaps between them, not enough to trip on, but enough to let the wind pass through instead of piling against a solid face. The underside would be kept clear of brush and debris so the wind had an unobstructed path. The railings would be single-sided and open, not solid barriers that would catch drifts. On the inside cover of the first notebook, Enoch had written something that made me stop reading and close my eyes. Snow always tells you where the wind surrendered. Build where it does not. I read that line 4 times. Then I read it aloud. It was not just about snow. It was about people. It was about how fear makes you stop moving. It was about where you choose to put your foundations, in the places where everyone else has given up, or in the places where the wind is still free. I sat on the floor of that cold cabin with 14 notebooks spread around me, and I understood for the first time that I was not alone. Someone had thought of me. Someone had believed I could do this. Someone had left me a map. I cried then. Not from grief exactly, from recognition, from the overwhelming fact that a man I had never met had looked at my life and seen something worth believing in. The next morning, I walked into Klein's Basin to buy lamp oil. The settlement was small, a mercantile, a feed store, a blacksmith's shed, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse. The mercantile was run by a woman named Nettie Vale, who had gray hair pinned back tight and a way of looking at customers like she was calculating their debts before they spoke. She saw me come in and said nothing. I found the lamp oil, brought it to the counter, and reached for my coins. When I set them down, she saw the notebook sticking out of my coat pocket. "That's Enoch Mercer's hand," she said. "I'd know that writing anywhere. He was my grandfather." "I know who you are." She wrapped the oil in brown paper and pushed it across the counter. "The girl from Denver, the one who inherited his rocks and his madness." I put the oil in my bag and did not look away from her. "What madness?" Nettie Vale laughed. It was not a kind laugh. "That man spent 20 years measuring snow like it was scripture, drove stakes into the ground, wrote everything down, talked about building a walkway 4 feet in the air like that was a reasonable thing to do. The whole valley thought he was touched." Did the whole valley ever look at what he measured? Didn't need to. We could see what he was, a man with too much time and not enough sense. She leaned forward across the counter. "You planning to inherit his obsession too?" I picked up my bag. "I'm planning to finish his work." She laughed again, harder this time. "Well, good luck with that. First big storm buries that bench 6 feet deep. Your grandfather died alone up there because nobody wanted to dig him out." I left the store without answering, but her words stayed with me all the way back to the cabin, rattling around in my skull like stones in a can. First big storm buries that bench 6 feet deep. The notebook said Enoch had found a way through that. But the notebooks were theory. The posts in the yard were unfinished, and winter was maybe 8 weeks away. The first months nearly killed me. I do not say that for dramatic effect. I mean it literally. I had flour for 4 meals. I had 17 cents left after buying lamp oil. I had no livestock except one half-wild goat that Enoch had apparently kept for milk, though she wanted nothing to do with me, and I spent 3 days chasing her around the property before I could get close enough to feed her. I set rabbit snares the way I had read about in a trapper's manual at St. Bridget's. The first week I caught nothing. The second week I caught one rabbit so small it was barely worth skinning. I ate it anyway. I ate everything. Wild onions from the creek bank, chokecherries from a thicket behind the barn, rose hips that made my mouth pucker but kept me standing. I lost weight I did not have to lose. My ribs started showing through my dress. My hands cracked and bled from the cold and the work and the constant exposure. I woke up dizzy some mornings. Hungry dizzy, not sick dizzy. The kind of dizzy where your body is telling you it is starting to burn pieces of itself because you have not given it enough from the outside. The first real storm came in late October. It was not a bad one by mountain standards. Maybe 6 inches of snow and a wind that blew steady from the northwest for 2 days. But it was enough to show me what I was dealing with. When the storm ended, the snow was piled 3 feet deep against the cabin's north wall. The drift curved around the corner and tapered off toward the west. The barn door was half buried. The yard between cabin and barn was a maze of uneven white shapes, some knee-high, some chest-high, with no clear path through. I spent 2 hours digging my way to the barn to check on the goat. She was fine. The barn had protected her. But by the time I finished digging, I was soaked with sweat under my coat and shaking from the cold. My hands were so stiff I could barely hold the shovel. And then I looked at the posts. They were still visible, every single one. The snow had piled around them, but the tops stuck up above the drifts, evenly spaced, marking a line from cabin to barn. The wind had not buried them. The wind had gone around them, or under them, or through the gaps between them. The posts were too narrow and too widely spaced to stop the moving air. So the air kept moving, and the snow kept moving with it, and the posts stayed clear. Enoch's theory was right. The raised walkway would work. I just had to build it before the real storms came. The problem was that I had no money, no help, and no experience building anything larger than a birdhouse. I had 14 notebooks full of instructions, but the instructions assumed tools and materials I did not have. Enoch had planned to buy fresh-cut lodgepole pine from a mill in Walden. I could not afford a single board. I would have to cut the timber myself. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of my life. Harder than the orphanage, harder than the families who did not want me, harder than anything I had imagined when I looked at Enoch's diagrams and thought, I can do this. I borrowed an axe from the barn, a heavy thing with a cracked handle that Enoch had wrapped in leather to hold together. I found a stand of lodgepole pine on the slope above the property, maybe half a mile from the cabin. I walked there every morning in the dark, spent the daylight hours felling trees and trimming branches, and dragged the logs back to the yard by hand. One tree, one day, sometimes 2 days for a large one. My hands blistered, burst, and blistered again. The blisters calloused over into hard ridges that split in the cold. I wrapped them in strips of old wool the way I had seen a drawing of a boxer's hands, and I kept swinging. I ate whatever I could find. The goat started producing a little milk once I figured out how to handle her. I snared 3 more rabbits. I found a root cellar behind the cabin with a few jars of preserves that Enoch had put up before he died, mostly choke cherry jam and pickled beets. But it was food. I did not sleep well. The wind kept me awake. The cold kept me awake. The thought of failure kept me awake. One night in early November, I sat on the cabin floor with one of Enoch's notebooks open in my lap, and I thought very seriously about giving up. The posts were in the ground, 6 of them anyway, out of the 12 I needed, but I had not set a single joist. I had not laid a single plank. Winter was coming fast, and I was alone, and I was not strong enough, and nobody in the valley believed this would work. And maybe they were right. I turned the page of the notebook, and there was an entry in Enoch's hand that I had not read before. November the 3rd, 1868. Set the first 2 pilings this week, both heaved by frost the next night. I reset them deeper and cursed a good deal. Marta says I will kill myself on this bench. She's probably right. But I cannot stop seeing the solution. If I can lift the path above the snow, if I can let the wind keep moving underneath, then the path stays clear. I know it. I know it the way I know my own name. The valley thinks I'm mad. Maybe I am. But I would rather be mad and right than sane and buried. I laughed out loud. It was an ugly sound, cracked and tired, but it was a laugh. He had failed the same way I was failing. He had set posts and watched them heave. He had cursed and started over. He had been alone with an idea that everyone mocked, and he had not stopped. I closed the notebook. I put another piece of wood in the stove, and the next morning I went back to the ridge to cut more trees. By the end of November, I had 12 posts set and cross-braced. They stood 4 feet above the ground, spaced at 8-foot intervals, running in a straight line from my front step to the barn door. 41 feet of path, if you measured from threshold to threshold. The joists came next. Enoch's diagrams showed how to notch them so they would lock into the posts and support the deck planking. I'd never done joinery before, but I had read about it, and I had his drawings, and I had 2 more weeks before the deep cold set in. I made mistakes. The first joist sat crooked because I had cut the notch too wide on one side. I shimmed it with scraps and kept going. The second joist split when I hammered it into place too hard. I threw it off the structure, retrieved it an hour later because I could not afford to waste materials, and used the pieces for bracing. By the second week of December, I had a deck. Planks laid across the joists with small gaps between them, 1/4-inch gaps maybe, enough to see through but not enough to catch a boot heel. The deck was narrow, barely 3 feet across, but it was solid. I could walk from my front door to the barn without touching the ground. I built a single railing on the north side, thinking it would be useful to hang on to in high wind. The first storm after that dumped 6 inches of packed snow against the leeward side of the railing. The wind had hit the solid face and dropped its load, right where I needed to walk. I tore the railing down in a fury and rebuilt it with open spacing between the uprights. That was the lesson. Anything solid became a drift trap. Anything open let the wind pass. The real test came 3 days before Christmas. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound like the world ending. The wind was not just blowing, it was screaming. It hit the cabin in gusts that made the whole structure shudder. I could hear things striking the walls, ice crystals, debris, pieces of branch carried on the wind. I lay in my cot and listened and thought, this is it. This is the storm that buries me. It lasted 2 days. When the wind finally dropped, I opened the cabin door and could not see the yard. The drift against the north wall was taller than I was. It curved around the corner and blocked half the window. The ground between cabin and barn was a white chaos, drifts piled in waves and ridges, and strange wind-sculpted shapes that looked almost deliberate. I could not see the walkway. For a long, terrible moment, I thought it was buried. I thought the whole structure had been swallowed. I thought Enoch's theory was wrong and Nettie Vale was right, and I was going to die on this bench the same way my grandfather had. Then I looked closer. The walkway was there. The posts stuck up above the drifts, just as they had after the October storm. But this time, I could see the deck too. It was dusted with snow, maybe 2 inches of fine powder on top, but it was not buried. It was not blocked. The wind had gone underneath it, had dropped its load on either side, had left the path itself clear. I climbed the steps to the walkway and stood there shaking. The drift under the midspan was enormous, maybe 4 feet high, rounded and packed, curving up toward the deck like a frozen wave. But the deck was above it. The deck was clear. I could walk from my front door to the barn without tunneling, without digging, without fighting. I walked it once, slowly, feeling the boards solid under my feet. The goat was bleeding in the barn, and I could hear her because I was close enough to hear her, because the path was open. I reached the barn door and leaned my forehead against the wood and said aloud, "You were right." I was talking to Enoch, but I was also talking to myself. Sven Halvorsen arrived that afternoon. I heard the horse before I saw it, hooves crunching through crusted snow, the creak of a saddle, a man's low voice talking to the animal. I came out of the barn with a pitchfork in my hands, ready to defend myself against whatever this was. What it was a man who looked older than mountains, 70, maybe 75, white beard cut close to his jaw, eyes the color of faded denim, hands that were gnarled and spotted but still looked strong. He sat on a bay mare and looked at the walkway for a long time before he looked at me. "You built that?" he asked. "Some of it. My grandfather started it." Enoch Mercer. He said the name like it meant something. I knew Enoch, played checkers with him at the line shack below Willow Gap, argued about snow for 15 years. "What did you argue about?" "Whether it could be taught." He swung down from the horse, moving stiff but not weak. "Your granddad said snow wasn't random, said it had rules, said a man could learn the rules and build around them." He walked to the edge of the walkway and looked underneath at the massive drift. "I worked railroad snow sheds for 20 years. Never saw anyone try to outsmart a drift like this." "Did he outsmart it?" Sven looked at me. "You walked to your barn this morning without digging. What do you think?" I did not answer. I was afraid to say it out loud. He climbed the steps and walked the length of the deck, testing boards with his weight, running his hand along the railing. When he reached the other end, he turned and looked back at the cabin. "Your granddad wasn't building a bridge over dirt," he said. "He was building a road over a storm." He came back down the steps and stood in front of me. He was taller than I expected, even stooped with age. "My name is Sven Halvorsen. I live about 2 miles south, in a cabin that gets buried every winter. I came up here because I saw the line of your structure from the road yesterday and knew what it was trying to do." He paused. "And because I figured any granddaughter of Enoch Mercer might need help." "I don't have money to pay you." "Didn't ask for money." He looked at the walkway again. "This is a mind that watches before it swings a hammer. That's rarer than strength. Enoch had it. Looks like you do too." He stayed for dinner. I made soup out of rabbit and beets and the last of the preserves, and he ate it without complaint. He told me about the railroad days, about building trestles and snow sheds in the high country, about learning how timber holds weight and how wind moves through gaps. And he told me about his wife, Marta, and his youngest son, Jonas, who had died in a slide on the Rabbit Ears Road in the winter of 1878. He said it simply, the way you say something that has been true for a long time. A slide took them. I was in Walden buying nails. When I got back, they were already buried. Took 6 men 2 days to find the bodies. I did not know what to say, so I said, I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. He looked at the fire. I've measured every storm against that silence since. Every drift, every blow. Wondering if I could have built something that would have saved them. We sat without talking for a while. Then he said, your grandfather thought he could save people, not with prayers, with measurements, with timber and planning and stubborn work. He looked at me. What do you think? I think I want to finish what he started. Sven nodded. Then I'll help you. Not because I owe him, because I want to see if he was right. He rode home that night, but he came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and every morning for the next 6 months until the walkway became a system and the system became a way of life. I did not know, that first night, how little time we would have together. I did not know his lungs were already failing. I did not know that every climb to the ridge to cut timber was costing him days he did not have. I knew only that I was no longer alone, and that the winter, for the first time since I had arrived, felt survivable. But the real test had not come. The walkway worked for one storm. It had to work for every storm. It had to work when the whole valley was buried. It had to work when people who had mocked my grandfather came looking for proof that he was wrong. The deep winter was still ahead, and I was still, in the eyes of the valley, a girl with a dead man's notebooks and a bridge over dry land. Sven taught me things the notebooks could not. Enoch had been a watcher. He had measured and recorded and theorized. But Sven had been a builder. He had spent 20 years on railroad crews, putting up trestles over canyons and snow sheds through mountain passes. He knew how timber behaved under load. He knew which joints held and which ones failed. He knew the difference between a structure that looked strong and one that actually was. The first thing he showed me was how I'd been setting my braces wrong. You've got them pinned at the top and bottom, he said, crouching beside one of the posts with his hand on the crosspiece. That's stable in calm weather, but when the wind hits, the whole thing wants to rack. He made a motion with his hands, showing how the structure would twist. You need a diagonal. Triangles don't rack. We spent 2 days adding diagonal braces to every post. My arms burned from holding timber in place while Sven drove the pegs. His cough got worse when he worked hard, but he would not stop until each brace was set. Your granddad understood snow, Sven said one afternoon, sitting on an upturned bucket while I finished a joint he had started. But he was a rancher, not a carpenter. He knew what he wanted to build. He just didn't know how to make it stand for 50 years. Can you teach me? I can teach you enough. He looked at his hands. Don't know how many winters I've got left in me. The lungs are going. Have been for a while. He said it the same way he had said everything else, plain, without drama. But I can teach you enough to finish this, and enough to teach someone else after I'm gone. That was the bargain we made. He would give me everything he knew about building. I would give him the chance to see Enoch's theory proven before he died. We worked through the rest of that winter and into the spring. When the snow melted, we could see where the drifts had really sat. The walkway had done exactly what Enoch predicted. The path was clear. The snow had piled underneath and on either side, but the deck itself had stayed passable through every storm. Sven walked the length of it in April, when the boards were dry and the sun was warm, and he said, "This is just the beginning. You've got a path to the barn. What about a path to the hay shed? What about the stock gate? What about the fence lines that catch snow where the cattle need to walk?" I looked at the diagrams in Enoch's notebooks. He had sketched the whole property, marking drift zones and clear zones, showing where barriers helped and where they trapped. The walkway was one piece of a larger system. We can do all of it, I said. Not we. Sven coughed into his hand. You. I'll help while I can, but this is your work now. By the summer of 1885, we had added a raised feed run from the hay shed to the barn loft, 12 yards long, chest high at its midpoint, with the same open spacing that let the wind pass underneath. Sven designed the joints. I cut and hauled the timber. We worked together on the assembly, him directing and me lifting, until my shoulders burned and his breath came in short, ragged pulls. We repositioned the fence that had been trapping snow in front of the stock gate. Enoch's diagrams showed exactly where the drift formed and why. The fence was perpendicular to the prevailing wind, creating a dead zone where snow piled 6 feet deep every winter. We moved it 20 feet east and angled it so the wind would carry its load past the gate instead of dropping it there. We built a narrow windbreak wing on the north side of the barn. Not to stop the snow, that would just create another trap, but to redirect it, to drop the drift where it would form a protective bank instead of a killing wall. Progress became something I could count. 6 main pilings reset and cross-braced, 41 feet of raised walkway from cabin to barn, 12 yards of feed run added, 1 stock gate moved 20 feet east, 8 drift stakes set for winter measurements, 11 head of cattle purchased with the last of Enoch's savings, which I found in a tin behind the stove, 14 yearlings born that spring and wintered successfully. The physical cost was visible on my body. My hands did not look like a girl's hands anymore. They were calloused and scarred, with permanent ridges where the blisters had healed over and over. My shoulders were broader. My arms were stronger. I had gained back the weight I lost that first winter and added muscle on top of it. But Sven was going the other direction. He moved slower every month. The cough that had been occasional became constant. Some mornings he could not climb the ridge with me, and I would find him sitting on the porch when I came back, watching the clouds and breathing carefully. You should rest, I told him once. I'll rest when I'm dead, he said. Until then, I've got work to do. In October of 1885, I went to Klein's Basin to buy spikes. Nettie Vale was behind the counter, same as always. She watched me count out my coins. I had money now, from selling milk and eggs to the few neighbors who would buy from me. And she watched me pick up the bag of spikes. And then she said, loud enough for the 2 other women in the store to hear, "Still building that bridge to nowhere?" I set the bag down on the counter. It's not a bridge to nowhere. It's a raised walkway with open decking that lets wind pass underneath instead of piling snow against a solid face. That's a lot of fancy words for a pile of lumber. That pile of lumber kept my path clear through every storm last winter. I walked to my barn every morning without digging. Can you say the same? Nettie's face went tight. My husband dug us out just fine. Your husband spent 3 days last January cutting a trench to your chicken coop. I know because Tom Arnett told me. He said your husband's back gave out and Tom had to finish the job. The 2 women in the store had stopped pretending to shop. They were watching now. You can't outsmart a Colorado winter, girl, Nettie said. Your grandfather tried. Look where it got him. My grandfather died with the answer in his notebooks. I'm just finishing what he started. I picked up my spikes. And when the next bad winter comes, you'll see who was right. I walked out before she could answer, but I heard her say to the other women, that girl is as touched as the old man. Mark my words. I marked her words. I remembered them. I would remember them for a long time. The first outsider to see the system and react with something other than mockery was Tom Arnett. Tom was 17, a hired hand at the Briggs place 3 miles south. He came to trade nails for milk after a January storm in 1886. And when he saw the raised walkway, he stopped walking and stared. There's snow clear to my waist at home, he said. How is your path open? Because it's designed to stay open. I walked him through it. The elevation, the spacing, the open deck, the diagonal braces. He listened the way a hungry person eats, taking in every word. Can you build one of these for the Briggs place? I can show you how, but Mr. Briggs would have to want it. Tom shook his head. Mr. Briggs thinks your grandfather was crazy. He won't spend money on crazy. Then I guess Mr. Briggs will keep digging. Tom bought his milk and left, but he came back a week later with more questions, and a week after that. And by spring, he was helping me set posts on the weekends, learning the way I had learned by watching and doing and failing and trying again. The trading began small. Milk and eggs at first, carried to a stand I set up at the crossroads on market days. Then sheltered board for weak calves. Ranchers whose animals were struggling would bring them to my barn for a few days, where the raised feed run made it easy to keep them warm and fed. I charged in oats and lamp oil and hardware, not cash. Cash was scarce. Goods were real. The system was producing more than I needed to survive. That was the change. For the first time since I had arrived, I was not just holding on. I was building something that could grow, but not everyone saw it that way. Boone Kittredge found me at the stockyards in Walden in the spring of 1886. Boone was the foreman for the Rocking K, the biggest cattle outfit in the basin. He was 45, built like a barrel, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of red rock, and a voice that carried across any room. He had offered me $5 for Enoch's property the month after I arrived, and he had laughed when I refused. Now he walked up to me while I was loading oats into a wagon and said, "I hear you've been selling milk." "I have." "And boarding calves." "That too." He leaned against the wagon and looked at me the way a man looks at something he is calculating the price of. "That windy scrap of Mercer's isn't going to keep you alive through one hard year. The wells run dry, the grass dies, and you've got nothing but rocks and posts. Sell it to me now while you can still get something for it. I'll give you $10. That's twice what I offered before." "The land isn't for sale." "Everything's for sale. You just haven't hit your price yet." He smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. "One bad winter, one drought summer, and you'll be begging me to take it off your hands. I've seen it happen to better ranchers than you." I set down the sack of oats and turned to face him fully. "You don't want my land, Mr. Kittredge. You want to stop seeing what you missed." His smile disappeared. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means my grandfather spent 30 years figuring out how to survive winters that bury everyone else, and you walked past his work every time you rode through the basin, and you never once stopped to ask what he was doing. You called him crazy because it was easier than admitting he might know something you didn't." Boone's face went dark. "Your grandfather was a fool who died alone on a pile of rocks, and you're going to end up the same way." "Maybe, but if I do, it won't be because I stopped trying." I picked up the oats and threw them into the wagon. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." He did not follow me, but I felt his eyes on my back all the way out of the yard. Professor Elias Ward arrived in the spring of 1886, sent by a railroad contact of Sven's who had heard about the walkway and wanted to see it for himself. Ward was a civil engineer from Colorado Agricultural College, traveling through the basin to study stock losses and wintering methods. He was small and precise, with spectacles and a notebook of his own, and he spent 3 hours walking the property before he said a word to me. When he finally spoke, his first question was, "Where did you learn drift mechanics?" "From my grandfather's notebooks." "May I see them?" I showed him. He read for 2 hours, making notes, asking questions, tracing Enoch's diagrams with his finger. When he finished, he closed the notebook and looked at me with an expression I had not seen before. Respect, maybe, or recognition. "This is not folly," he said. "This is drift control built by observation instead of theory. Your grandfather spent 3 decades doing what engineers are only now beginning to study systematically. He was ahead of his time." He was laughed at. Pioneers usually are. Ward stood up and looked out the window at the raised walkway. "I would like to write a circular about this, a short publication for stockmen, explaining the principles and showing how to apply them. If your system survives another hard winter, it could save lives across the territory. It will survive. Then I'll be back in the spring to document it." He paused. "With your permission, I would credit both your grandfather and yourself. Enoch Mercer for the theory, Ada Mercer for the proof." I did not cry, but I came close. That summer, the wells in the basin ran full. The creeks ran clear. The grass grew thick and green, and everyone's cattle fattened, and people stopped worrying about winter because the weather had been kind. I did not stop worrying, neither did Sven. When everyone relaxes, he said one evening, watching the sunset from the porch, that's when the bad one comes. Weather doesn't care if you're ready. It just arrives. I looked at the drift stakes I had set around the property, the same kind Enoch had used, marked with measurements from every storm. I looked at the raised walkway and the feed run and the repositioned fences. I looked at the system we had built. We're ready, I said. Sven coughed and did not answer. The winter of 1886 to 1887 came early and hard. The first snow fell in October before the cattle were properly gathered. It fell wet and heavy, and then the temperature dropped, and then the wind started, and by morning the basin was white and still and wrong. I knew something was different the moment I woke. The light was different. The sound was different. Even the air inside the cabin felt different, thicker somehow, charged with a pressure I could feel in my teeth. When I opened the door, I understood. The drift against the north wall was already 4 feet deep. The sky was the color of lead, and the wind was not just blowing, it was screaming, driving snow horizontal across the yard in sheets so thick I could barely see the barn. The walkway was passable. I walked it with a broom, sweeping the powder off the deck, and the path stayed clear beneath my feet while the yard on either side filled with white. The wind went underneath. The system worked. But this was not the worst of it. This was only the beginning. The storms came in waves. First, the October blow. Then a brief thaw that crusted the snow into a hard shell. Then another storm, colder and drier, that packed powder on top of the crust. Then wind that stripped the high ground bare and filled the low ground 20 feet deep. The pattern repeated through November and December. Storm, thaw, crust, storm, wind. Each cycle made things worse. The crust made it impossible for cattle to paw through to grass. The drifts made it impossible to reach feed. The cold made it impossible to stay outside long enough to dig. People started dying, not people. Cattle first. But cattle dying meant people would follow. The Briggs place lost 30 head in the first 3 weeks. The animals could not reach food. They stood in drifts up to their bellies, too weak to move, and froze where they stood. Tom Arnett came to my door in December with his face gray and his hands shaking and said, "Mr. Briggs won't listen. He says we just need to dig harder, but we can't dig fast enough. The snow fills back in before we finish." I gave Tom what I could spare: milk, hay, advice about temporary shelters. But the Briggs place was 3 miles away, and their buildings were set wrong, and no amount of digging would fix what was broken in their design. The Vale place went next. Nettie's husband tried to tunnel from the house to the barn after a 3-day blow and got disoriented in the white. They found him 20 feet from the barn door, frozen stiff, his lantern still in his hand. Nettie came to town with her children and did not speak to anyone for a week. The Rocking K lost cattle by the 100. Boone Kittredge had 10,000 head scattered across the basin, and there was no way to reach them, no way to feed them, no way to do anything but watch the snow pile higher and wait for the thaw to show him what was left. People called it the Great Dieup. They would call it that for years afterward. The winter that ended the open range, the winter that proved you could not just turn cattle loose and expect the land to keep them alive. I watched it happen from my walkway. I walked to my barn every morning. I fed my cattle through the raised feed run. I measured the drifts against my stakes and recorded the data in Enoch's notebooks, continuing the work he had started. My system held. 22 head fed morning and evening through the worst week. Milk still running 6 to 8 quarts a day from the strongest cows. No day with barn access fully lost. Drift against the cabin north wall, 9 feet at the peak. Drift under the walkway midspan, 4 feet high, but the deck was clear above it. I was alive. My cattle were alive. And everyone around me was drowning in white. The worst night came in January. Sven had been staying at the cabin since December, too weak to make the ride to his own place. His cough had become constant, a wet rattle that woke me every few hours. He could not work anymore, but he could still direct, still point out where braces needed strengthening, still tell me when I was making a mistake. That night, the wind hit harder than anything I had felt before. It did not gust. It sustained, a constant pressure that made the cabin walls groan and the stovepipe whistle. I lay in my cot and listened to Sven coughing and thought, if the walkway fails tonight, we die. In the morning, the walkway had not failed, but Sven could not get out of bed. His face was gray. His breathing was shallow. When I brought him water, his hand shook too badly to hold the cup. I need to check the cattle, I said. Go, he whispered. I'll be here when you get back. I walked the path to the barn. The wind had scoured the deck clean, not even powder left on top. The drift underneath had grown to 5 feet, a massive white wave frozen in place. But the path was open. I fed the cattle. I checked the calves. I milked the cows that needed milking. When I came back, Sven was still breathing. But his eyes were closed, and he did not open them when I called his name. He lived 3 more days. He did not speak again, but sometimes his eyes would open and find me, and I would hold his hand and tell him what I had done that day. The walkway held. The cattle were fed. The system worked. On the 3rd day, he stopped breathing. I buried him in the spring, when the ground thawed enough to dig. I put him on the rise west of the barn, where he could keep an eye on bad carpentry, like he always said. I planted willow cuttings on his grave because he had loved any living thing that could bend without breaking. The first person to come asking was Boone Kittredge. He arrived in February during a brief lull between storms. He was not riding his usual horse. That horse was probably dead. He came on a mule with his hat in both hands, and behind him walked 2 half-frozen heifers and Tom Arnett carrying a calf wrapped in canvas. Boone stopped at the edge of my property and looked at the walkway. Then he looked at me. I need your barn, he said, for 1 night. I could have made him beg. I could have reminded him of the $5, the $10, the sneering voice in the stockyard. I could have repeated every word he had said about my grandfather and asked him how it felt to be wrong. I did not do any of those things. Get them inside before they go down, I said. He led the heifers up the walkway to the barn. Tom followed with the calf. I showed them where to put the animals, how to use the feed run, where the water was. Boone did not speak except to ask questions. His face was the color of old ash. The line grew from there. Nettie Vale came the next day, carrying 2 empty buckets and her youngest child on her hip. She did not look at me when she asked for milk. I gave it to her without comment. The Briggs family came with what was left of their herd, 7 cattle out of 60. I sheltered them in my barn and showed the Briggses how to set a temporary raised run to my hay shed. 3 families came the day after that, then 5, then more. I did not turn anyone away. I did not charge. I did not remind anyone of what they had said about my grandfather or about me. Sven would have understood. One night, before he stopped speaking, he had watched Boone lead stock across the yard and muttered, "They don't deserve this." I had said, "Maybe not, but the storm doesn't care who laughed. If I know a safer way through it, then that belongs to more than me." That was the truth I had learned from Enoch's notebooks, from Sven's teaching, from 2 winters on this bench. Knowledge is not revenge. It is not a weapon. It is a door, and you can either open it or keep it shut, and the kind of person you are depends on which one you choose. I opened the door. I let them in. I gave away what I had because that was what the work was for. By March, the worst was over. The snow began to melt. The creeks began to run. The bodies of cattle appeared everywhere, in draws, against fences, in the open fields where they had stood until they could not stand anymore. The basin smelled of death for weeks. But my cattle were alive. 20 head. The calves I had sheltered for other families were alive. The heifers Boone had brought were alive, and everyone knew why. Sister Agatha Keene arrived in April on a church relief wagon that had been traveling through the basin distributing supplies. I did not recognize her at first, She was smaller than I remembered, older, her wimple less white than it had been, but her eyes were the same, sharp and assessing and not entirely kind. She stepped down from the wagon and looked at the walkway for a long time. Then she looked at me. "You built this?" "My grandfather designed it. I finished it." She walked the length of the deck, her black habit stark against the lingering snow. When she reached the barn, she turned and walked back. Her face was unreadable. "I was wrong about him," she said finally. "And I was wrong about you." "Yes, you were." She flinched, but she did not look away. "There is something I must tell you. Something I should have told you before you left Denver." I waited. "Your grandfather wrote to St. Bridget's twice while he was alive. The first letter asked about you, your health, your education, your temperament. I answered it with a general report. The second letter arrived 6 months before he died. It contained rail fare and a request that you be sent to him immediately. He said he had work that needed finishing and a girl who might be suited to finish it." My chest went tight. "What happened to the letter?" "I burned it." She said it plainly, without excuse. "I believed a mountain ranch was no place for a girl. I believed he was unstable. I believed I was protecting you. You believed wrong." "Yes." Her voice cracked just slightly. "I spent 2 years telling myself I had done the right thing, and then you left anyway, and I heard nothing, and I assumed—" She stopped. "I assumed you were dead, that the ranch had killed you, that my original judgment had been correct, even if my method had been wrong. And now?" She looked at the walkway, at the barn, at the cattle moving in the yard, at everything my grandfather had dreamed and I had built. "Now I see that I was a fool," she said, "and that my foolishness cost you 2 years you could have spent with him." I thought about what I wanted to say. I thought about the cold cabin and the empty flour tin and the nights I had almost given up. I thought about finding the notebooks and reading Enoch's letter and realizing that someone had wanted me before I was worth anything to anyone. "I forgive you," I said. "Not because you chose well, because I will not carry your fear another mile." Sister Agatha's eyes filled with tears. She did not wipe them away. She nodded once, turned, and climbed back onto the wagon. I never saw her again. Professor Ward returned in May, as he had promised. He spent a week documenting the system, measuring, sketching, interviewing neighbors about the winter. When he finished, he shook my hand and said, "This will save lives." The circular was published that fall. Drift managed winter access for stockyards and house barn runs by Professor Elias Ward, Colorado Agricultural College. The introduction credited Enoch Mercer's 28 years of observation and Ada Mercer's successful construction and proof. My grandfather's name was in print. His work was real. The valley that had called him mad could read his vindication in black and white. Sven had left me his tools, his mule, and a leather roll of bridge notes from his railroad years. I used them to expand the work over the next decade. I built raised walks and feed runs for 6 ranches in the basin. I taught Tom Arnett and his brothers how to set posts and read drift patterns. I married Jacob Arnett, Tom's older brother, in 1891 because he listened more than he talked and never once called the bench unlucky. We had 3 children. The years passed the way years do when you are working. Visitors came, engineers, stockmen, a few writers who wanted to tell the story. I showed them the notebooks. I walked them through the system. I answered their questions and sent them away with diagrams. I grew old. My hands knew every rail and brace on that ranch the way a pianist knows keys in the dark. My body remembered the work even when my mind wandered. I could walk the path from cabin to barn with my eyes closed and never miss a step. I died in late spring of 1937 on a Tuesday morning. They found me on the walkway, one hand resting on the rail I had rebuilt 3 times over 50 years. My daughter said I looked like I had only stopped a moment to listen to the wind. The system still works. The walkway still stands. Every winter the snow piles underneath and the path stays clear, just as Enoch predicted, just as I proved. His first notebook is in a glass front case by the cabin door now. The inside cover faces out so visitors can read his handwriting. Snow always tells you where the wind surrendered. Build where it does not. I think about Sister Agatha sometimes, about the dining room in Denver, the cold oatmeal, the laughter, about a woman who heard my grandfather had left me a bridge over dry land and a barn full of weather and decided that was a joke. It was not a joke. It was the beginning of everything. So let me ask you something. What have you refused to build because someone laughed first? What part of your life have you left at ground level because everyone around you swore the weather would stay kind? What idea have you buried behind a false wall in your mind, wrapped in oilcloth, waiting for the day you are ready to be the person who opens it? Most people do not mock useless things. They mock useful things that arrive too early. They mock the bridge before the storm. They mock the preparation before the need. They mock the person who builds while everyone else waits, because building while waiting is lonely and strange and hard to explain. My grandfather spent 28 years measuring snow. His neighbors thought he was mad. His family thought he was wasting his life. Even Sister Agatha, who never met him, thought she knew enough to throw his letters away. But he was not mad. He was early, and the winter that killed 10,000 cattle in that basin did not kill mine, because he had measured, because he had planned, because he had written it all down for a girl he had never met, on the chance that she might be stubborn enough to listen. You do not need to be strong to build something extraordinary. You do not need to be lucky. You do not need permission from the people who laugh. You need to measure, to watch, to ask questions that no one else is asking, to build the bridge before the storm arrives, even when everyone tells you the storm will never come. It will come. It always comes. The only question is whether you will be ready. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about your own unbuilt bridges and your own sealed notebooks, then subscribe. There are more stories here about ordinary people who built extraordinary things in the places everyone else had given up on. People who measured when others mocked. People who prepared when others waited. People who opened doors that had been shut for years. Your bridge is waiting. Build it before the weather turns.